Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Xavier Legette, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 10 wide receiver rankings for the 2024 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses are allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers so we can identify the most advantageous matchups going into the week. After which, I'll transition into talking about my top 40 wide receiver rankings, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions on each individual player while presenting statistics in order to justify their overall rankings. If you're looking for my thoughts on an individual player, be sure to travel down to the description of the video. We have timestamps available for every single player, so you can find the players that are on your current roster. Outside of that, again, while you're down in the description, if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe and click the bell notification button. Besides the daily content, we're also live streaming on a daily basis over the course of this entire season. Later tonight, starting at 7 p.m. PST, I'll be answering questions, so if you have any, be sure to swing on by, ask questions, whether it's starter sits, trade questions, waiver wire questions, whatever it may be. I'm happy to help. Thank you very much. And before we go ahead and begin, while you're down in the description, if you guys have not yet already, be sure to check out Underdog. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make that first time deposit minimum of $10, not only will you be able to go ahead and claim the first time deposit offer and potentially follow the overall entries that we make over the course of the week. This upcoming Thursday, of course, we're going to have some exciting ones. I'll share that in tomorrow's video with tight end and quarterback rankings, but you'll also get my rankings sent to you from my email directly to yours every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. These rankings are by position, by tier, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, defense, and flex for half and full PPR. For those of you who are trying to take advantage of the opportunity, check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility. If you are not eligible based on your current location or have used a code in the past, you can always get my rankings via Patreon. Links down in the description. Thank you very much for all the support. All right, let's go ahead and begin with the first topic of the day in regards to wide receiver matchups. Now, in regards to receiving statistics allowed by each individual defense, we have found that thus far this season, the Vikings, Ravens, Detroit Lions, Jaguars, Buccaneers, etc. are the most advantageous matchups at the wide receiver position. Now, what the Vikings, Ravens, and Detroit Lions all have in common is that their offenses play incredibly well. They take early leads, and it forces the opposing team to have to throw for the entirety of the second half, which continues to rack up stats against them. Nonetheless, every single team is throwing the ball against them, and they have found an incredible volume of success. Even though the Minnesota Vikings have players in their secondary like Harrison Smith, Stephon Gilmore, Byron Murphy, it doesn't matter. If they're going to continue to throw at the secondary, statistics will be gathered over the course of the week, and there are going to be instances, just like last week, in which Josh Downs and Michael Pittman are not able to take advantage of the matchup on hand. Nonetheless, we'll reference back to these statistics over the course of today's episode. Also want to talk about some of the more disadvantageous matchups, wide receivers against the Jets, the Dolphins, the Chiefs, the Bears, etc. These are ones that you might want to be careful with, but if you have a wide receiver that is getting themselves consistent volume of opportunity, for example, we talk about potentially Courtland Sutton coming off of back-to-back weeks of double-digit targets and 100-yard receiving games, taking on the Chiefs, I'm still firing him up. Obviously at a lesser capacity considering how incredibly well the Chiefs secondary has played, but I still believe he has himself a lot of opportunity to find success. Okay, with this all covered, let's go ahead and let's transition into talking about my top 40 wide receiver rankings, beginning with our number one. For the Thursday night matchup, we have Ja'Marr Chase taking on the Baltimore Ravens. Ja'Marr Chase is coming off of a week which was quite underwhelming considering Joe Burrow threw 5 touchdowns. Ja'Marr Chase not implicated for any of them, but nonetheless had himself 11 targets, 7 catches for 43, but now has an opportunity to bounce back against the Baltimore Ravens, who earlier this season had himself his best game of the year, in which he had 12 targets, 10 catches, 193 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, and 36.3 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. Not only does he have an incredible matchup against, again, the second best matchup at the wide receiver position, as that secondary alone is allowing 35.31 fantasy points per game. The last time against them, besides him playing well, T. Higgins had himself an incredible game of 9 catches, 83 and 2 receiving touchdowns. Burrow nearly threw for 400 yards and 5 touchdowns. The entire offense found themselves a premium level of success against the Baltimore Ravens, and they're going to do so once again. And considering T. Higgins is probably not going to play within the upcoming matchup, we're anticipating all of the opportunity to go in the direction of the one and only Ja'Marr Chase. Again, we have most recently seen wide receivers find themselves in abundance of success against the secondary. Washington wide receivers, 16 catches for 154, 2 touchdowns. Cleveland's wide receivers, 20 catches for 263, 2 touchdowns. Even Courtland Sutton last week, 7 catches for 122. We're expecting a lot of success on Thursday night for Ja'Marr Chase. Number 2, we have Justin Jefferson, who again, as of the last 7 consecutive games, 81 or more receiving yards, coming off of back-to-back games of over 100 receiving yards, and should make it 3 in a row because he only needs 103 receiving yards more in order to break the record for the most receiving yards total within the first 5 seasons of an NFL career at the wide receiver position. Therefore, I'm anticipating Justin Jefferson to be given a lot of opportunity in order to break this record against a secondary like the Jaguars, which is allowing over 30 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, the 4th best matchup at the position. We're not only hoping for, 8 catches, 100 yards. We're hoping for a touchdown for him to find his overall upside within the given matchup. Number 3, We have another LSU wide receiver, Malik Nabers. Malik Nabers last week, even though his overall yardage count was relatively low with a 59 total, he had 11 targets and 9 catches, which again is very much so promising for those of you who play in a full PPR. In a half PPR, you still take advantage of it, but in the long term, we obviously want him to eventually find those touchdowns or make big plays down the field. In 5 of the last 6 games, he's been given 11 or more targets, which is very promising, but this most recent week only had a 4.8 ADOT, which is an average depth of target. So only 4.8 yards down the field was the average depth of his overall opportunities, which again didn't lead to very many yards. But earlier this season, over the course of weeks 2 through 8, his ADOT was over 10 every single game. So they've used him a lot closer to the line of scrimmage as of late, but taking on the Carolina Panthers, whether it's close to the line of scrimmage or deep down the field, he's going to find success and he should have himself a huge bounce back performance. I've told many of you over the course of the last couple of days, you should be trying to get Nabers on your team now before he has another one of those big games in which you are not able to trade for him ever again for the remainder of the season. We've most recently seen wide receivers like Courtland Sutton go for 8 for 100 against them, McLaurin 6 for 98, with Marcus Mariota at quarterback, London 6 for 74 and a touchdown, DJ Moore 5 catches, 105 and 2 touchdowns. Malik Nabers, the next man up to have himself a big performance against the Carolina secondary. Number 4, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown. Look, even though the Detroit Lions are blowing out teams and running the ball heavily, this most recent week, 7 catches, 56 and a touchdown, we'll take it, especially considering the weather conditions of the entire experience. Now has an opportunity of taking on the Houston Texans indoors, in which they're going to be able to go against the 6th best matchup at the wide receiver position. They're nearly allowing 30 fantasy points per game. You bring back Jameson Williams, which brings in another distractionary point, which will force this Houston defense to have to put coverage over the top in order to make sure that, Jameson Williams isn't causing absolute havoc. But we have recently seen wide receivers like Garrett Wilson, 9 catches, 92 touchdowns. Davante Adams in the same game, 7 for 91 and a touchdown. Josh Downs the week prior, 4 for 109 and a touchdown. We have seen wide receivers and a lot of slot receiving wide receivers find success. Therefore, Amon-Ra St. Brown should be the next man up to find himself an abundance of fantasy upside, hopefully scoring a touchdown once again this week. Number 5 is Nico Collins. In the same game, I wanted to mention Nico Collins as a kind of preliminary. Understand that if in fact he is active, you are starting him against the Detroit Lions. Again, not only is it a top 3 matchup at the position, allowing over 33 fantasy points per game. We've most recently seen guys like Jaden Reed 5 for 113, Ridley 10 for 143, Justin Jefferson 7 for 81 and a touchdown. We've seen great performances across the board against the secondary, but earlier today, Nico Collins did not practice, which is not a good sign, especially coming off of the injured reserve in which he has missed the last 4 games. We would have thought he would have been fully ready and practicing by today. Again, there is still tomorrow and Friday to ramp him up, but if in fact Nico Collins is active, you're playing him. Why? Because again, even though he has missed each of the last 4 games, he is still the number 16 overall wide receiver in fantasy football. From weeks 1 through 4, when healthy, was averaging 10.75 targets per game and 22.73 fantasy points per game in a half PPR. It's an incredible matchup. If he's active, he's in your lineup. Otherwise, Tank Dell will get himself a little bit of a boost in the absence of Nico Collins once again. Number 6, to begin the A tier, we have Cooper Kupp. Look, Cooper Kupp looks significantly healthier since that Week 8 matchup against Minnesota. Last week against the Seattle Seahawks looked incredible. 14 targets, the most amongst all wide receivers in Week 9. 11 receptions for 104 receiving yards. And yes, a lot of that was accumulated because of the absence of Puka Nacua after getting ejected. But regardless of that overall fact, when you're seeing Cooper Kupp look healthy, playing 92% of the snaps, had a target rate of 35%. So basically, on 35% of the routes that he ran, he was targeted. So 1 out of every 3 routes getting the ball in his direction, which is an incredible number. Playing 70% of the overall snaps from the slot position. We have seen slot receivers against the Miami Dolphins as of late. From Buffalo, 7 for 62 through the air. Arizona, 10 for 86. Indianapolis, 4 for 55. There's a lot of potential for Cooper Kupp to continue his streak of success this upcoming week against the Miami Dolphins secondary. Speaking of the Miami Dolphins, let's talk about Tyreek Hill. Look, the Bills matchup is not ideal for any wide receiver. So it wasn't going to be great for Tyreek Hill. He doesn't have a great history of success against that defense. They typically know how to bottle him up. But what the Rams don't know how to do is bottle up wide receivers. And they proved that last week as they gave up 180 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns to Jackson Smith-Njigba, and also gave up 63 yards and a touchdown to Tyler Lockett. Then the week prior to that, JJ went for 8 for 115. All those statistics coming within the first 3 quarters of the game. So going into this upcoming matchup, Tyreek Hill should be able to at least blow the doors off this overall defense and find himself the most success he has found since week 1. And hopefully that's going to be the case. Hopefully his overall rapport with Tua Tagovailoa begins to click. Again, it's a top 10 matchup at the wide receiver position. A secondary that, again, cannot cover wide receivers. If you can't stop JSN, I'd imagine that Tyreek Hill should have himself an upside performance here. Number 8, we have Garrett Wilson, who, again, is coming off of another great week. even though he's making catches with one hand, that's really all he needs. He needs one hand and he needs his shin, and he can score 2 touchdowns within a given week. Incredible performance last week against the Houston Texans. Even though the offense started incredibly slow in the first half, was still able to get himself 9 receptions on 10 targets, 90 receiving yards. That's 90 plus receiving yards in 4 of the last 5 games. The consistency of success, even in the presence of Davante Adams, is very promising. Taking on the Cardinals, the 11th best matchup at the position. We're hoping that the Cardinals are going to come out and fire out quickly, considering how well they have played on the ground and through the air as an offense as of late. It is very promising because then at that point, it'll force Aaron Rodgers to have to throw the ball for the majority of that second half and elevate the overall potential of Garrett Wilson and Davante Adams. Number 9, we have A.J. Brown. Look, A.J. Brown did leave last week's game at halftime and did not return due to a knee injury. But what we did see earlier today is very promising. He did practice today, which again is a fantastic sign in comparison to someone like Nico Collins not practicing today, very much so worrying. So as we see A.J. Brown taking on the Dallas Cowboys this week, the Dallas Cowboys secondary has dealt with a lot of injuries. Their defense as a whole has dealt with a lot of injuries. This should be a blowout. We've most recently seen the Atlanta Falcons wide receivers combine for 11 catches, 152, and 3 touchdowns. Detroit wide receivers 14 for 254 and 2 touchdowns. We're anticipating that the Philadelphia Eagles should find themselves in abundance of overall success, and a healthy A.J. Brown against a division rival is dangerous. Number 10 is Puka Nacua, who again, I think him getting ejected was the best possible thing that could have happened to him last week. Again, we have to remember that late last week, throughout the practice window, if I'm not mistaken, it was on a Thursday, he did re-aggravate his injury. So there was a lot of uncertainty as to whether or not he was going to play, but him getting ejected and not putting too much stress on that overall injury and getting him healthy going into this upcoming week is what they needed. The big 3 for the Rams offense, Cooper Kupp, Kyren Williams, and Puka Nacua are all going to feast every single week. It's just a matter of, are they healthy? If they're healthy, they're going to be very promising for fantasy purposes. Puka Nacua, again, we have seen him, even with 50% of the offensive snaps played against the Minnesota Vikings, go for over 100 receiving yards. I would assume that at a full healthy rate, having all that rest and not having to play for the majority of that second half of the Seattle Seahawks game, he should be in a perfect position to succeed within the upcoming matchup. Number 11 to begin the B tier is Zay Flowers. Look, Zay Flowers has been incredible. In the 6 games this season in which he has had 5 or more touches, he has accumulated 90 or more receiving yards in 5 of those 6 games. Again, incredible numbers across the board. Give this man opportunity and he is going to find success. Back in week 5 against the Cincinnati Bengals, who he has a privilege of taking on this upcoming Thursday night, he had 12 targets, 7 catches, and 111 receiving yards for 15.5 fantasy points and a half PPR. The Cincinnati Bengals, as we know, cannot play defense. They've most recently given up 8 catches for 81 to Cedric Tillman, 5 for 84 to AJB, 6 for 85 and a touchdown to DeVonta Smith, and most recently 8 catches for 105 to Jacoby Myers. We're anticipating continued success for Zay Flowers within the Thursday night matchup. Number 12, we have Deebo Samuel, the thumbnail of today's episode, taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Look, Deebo Samuel this season, in the 5 games in which he has had 5 or more targets, averaging 13.74 fantasy points per game. And now that the offense is going to get themselves a huge elevation of production with the return of Jauan Jennings and the one and only Christian McCaffrey, the entire offense has themselves even more opportunities to score on a weekly basis as Christian McCaffrey is going to continue to get them down to the red zone. Taking on the Buccaneers, again, the Buccaneers offense, regardless of who they play on defense, are going to continue to score. So this is going to keep it a competitive matchup, but the secondary for the Buccaneers cannot stop a soul. They're the 5th best matchup. We just saw D-Hop go for 8 for 86 and 2 touchdowns. It looked like the D-Hop of 2020. Then we talk about Darnell Mooney the week prior for 86 and a touchdown. Bateman the week prior to that, 4 for 121 and a touchdown. Deebo Samuel should find himself in abundance of success within the upcoming week. Number 13, we have Drake London. Now, we're not 100% certain as to what his status is. He's dealing with a hip pointer, which again, based on what I have read, it is not as serious of an injury as it could have potentially been, but he did not return to the game. Very similar to A.J. Brown, which again wasn't very promising. But as we continue, we're going to hope that he's going to be able to play and be active. And if in fact he practices for the entirety of the week, I'm going to move him up within my overall rankings. Because again, they take on the New Orleans Saints, and the Saints do not have a secondary. Having traded Marshon Lattimore is the biggest mistake that they could have made in regards to trying to stop Drake London this upcoming week. Even Darnell Mooney. Both of these wide receivers should have themselves an abundance of success because the last time out against the New Orleans Saints back in week 4, Drake London 12 targets, only 6 catches, 64 receiving yards because of the efforts of Marshon Lattimore. So if we're going to be in a situation in which, of course, you're taking on the Saints, the 12th best matchup at the position, they don't have Marshon Lattimore. They, of course, don't have Paulson Adebo, who's on the injured reserve. Kool-Aid McKinstry was missing last week because of an injury. Even their second string cornerbacks were also missing due to injury. If we're going to be in a situation in which their secondary is just beat up and not prepared to play, expect Drake London to have himself a huge performance here if he's healthy. Number 14, we have Terry McLaurin. Look, Terry McLaurin has just been consistent. And the number one consistent part of his overall game as of late is consistently scoring touchdowns. He has scored 6 touchdowns in the last 7 games. One of those games in which he didn't have, Jaden Daniels, unfortunately because of the rib injury, he had Marcus Mariota, still had himself 6 catches for 98, didn't score a touchdown in that game, but when he has been with Jaden Daniels, has been incredible. In fact, he has scored 6 touchdowns in the last 6 games with him. So going into this week's matchup, taking on the Pittsburgh Steelers, which of course we've most recently seen Slayton, of course, go for 4 catches, 108. Nabers, 7 catches for 71. Of course, the yardage is expected for Terry McLaurin, but also we're expecting him to find the end zone and have himself another upside week. This lack of targets last week isn't something that I'm concerned with. Number 5, we have Davante Adams, who again should have himself a lot of success against the Arizona Cardinals. Even though, Davante Adams had himself more targets than Garrett Wilson last week, he really did get lucky coming back into that game and scoring a touchdown. I mean, he somehow cleared concussion protocol within 15 minutes. Honestly, he looked like he was knocked out on the sideline after taking that big hit, and I thought he was done for the night. But then he comes back, scores a touchdown. He's making these secondary members look, stupid at times. And going into this weekend's matchup against the Arizona Cardinals, I'm going to assume that, of course, Davante Adams is going to make a lot of their cornerbacks look stupid as well. We've most recently seen wide receivers like Ayuk go for 8 catches for 147. The Green Bay wide receivers went for 160 and 4 touchdowns. Los Angeles Chargers wide receivers went for 13 catches, 195. Chicago's wide receivers, even though they couldn't even move the ball, still had 173 receiving yards between Moore, Keenan Allen, and Adunze last week. We're anticipating that Davante Adams isn't going to get locked up and should continue to get himself double-digit targets, hopefully, for the remainder of the season. Number 16, we have CeeDee Lamb, wide receiver of the Dallas Cowboys, who will have Cooper Rush as his quarterback this week. When I went ahead and looked back at 2022, from weeks 2 through 6, with Cooper Rush as the starting quarterback in the absence of Dak Prescott, throughout that span of time, CeeDee Lamb was averaging 9.8 targets per game, 6.2 receptions, 76 receiving yards, and 0.4 receiving touchdowns per game for 13.4 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. He has scored 10 or more fantasy points in 4 of the 5 games in which he played with Cooper Rush. Taking on the Philadelphia Eagles, we would assume this is going to be a negative game script for the entirety of the game. It would not surprise me if CeeDee Lamb finished the game with 15 plus targets and a plethora of overall opportunities to find himself success, hopefully within garbage time. Number 17, we have DeVonta Smith. On the other end of this overall matchup, we have DeVonta Smith, who again, even though he was able to be fantasy relevant this most recent week, in the absence of A.J. Brown in the second half, you would assume, especially with the Trevor Lawrence Jaguars roaring back due to the overall turnovers and them continuing to score, you would assume that DeVonta Smith would have had himself more than 6 targets. Now that you have yourself a situation in which DeVonta Smith isn't given enough opportunity, now you take on a matchup against the Dallas Cowboys, which could be a blowout very quickly and mean a lot of running the ball in the second half. And the potential return of Dallas Goedert is within the conversation, which again, all of these factors are lowering the overall potential of DeVonta Smith. Is it an advantageous matchup? Absolutely. But could this be a blowout that lessens his overall upside? Absolutely as well. That's kind of the fight that I'm having within my own mind as to whether or not I want to rank him highly or move him down in order to be safe. But as of right now, I think the number 17 spot is strong. I think it's just a matter of, is Jalen Hurts going to give him that opportunity to go score a touchdown? Because if in fact he does, number 17 is probably going to be a little bit too low for his overall potential for upside. Number 18 is George Pickens. Look, George Pickens taking on the Washington Commanders. The Commanders' defense has played relatively well as of late. And now that they bring in Marshawn Lattimore, that could be something that very much so impacts the overall potential for upside for George Pickens. But we've most recently seen George Pickens have himself an incredible game against the Jets secondary of all defenses. In the last 2 games with Russell Wilson, 14 targets, 9 catches, 185, and 1 touchdown, 29 fantasy points. So on average, 14 and a half PPR in the last 2 games with Russell Wilson. If it wasn't for the fact in week 8 against the New York Giants, in which he had 2 receiving touchdowns called back, could have easily scored a 3rd receiving touchdown in that game. If it wasn't for that, George Pickens, again, would be anticipated to be a very solid play, which again, this is why I have him at number 18. I think regardless of who they put in front of him, he is still going to be given the vast majority of opportunities. Mike Williams is not going to play very much this week, and it is all going to go in the direction of George Pickens in this upcoming matchup. Number 19 is D-Hop. DeAndre Hopkins taking on the Denver Broncos. He will most likely be lining up against Patrick Surtain II for majority of this game, but opportunity is king, and that is really what DeAndre Hopkins has been missing all season. He hasn't had more than the target count that he saw on Monday Night Football. 9 targets was the most, even if you compare him to like late last season within the Tennessee Titans offense. Yes, he was getting that range, but in those overall opportunities was highly successful. It's just about giving this man opportunity because he still has it. Obviously was a hidden gem last week and certainly didn't stay hidden. Had himself 24.6 fantasy points against that Tampa Bay secondary, which again is a great matchup. But now that you have to take on the Denver Broncos, it's not easy. Even though Zay Flowers, 5 catches for 127 and 2 touchdowns, and even Jalen Coker and Legette had scored a touchdown the week prior, both of them against Denver secondary, which again, Denver secondary has not looked great as of late. I expect Patrick Mahomes and D-Hop to continue their connection and continue to build a rapport every single week. Number 20, we have Brian Thomas Jr. So we did hear earlier today a couple reports regarding Trevor Lawrence being a little bit banged up and how the organization is elevating CJ Beathard to be the number 3 quarterback because they know that, of course, Mac Jones is going to be the quarterback too. I don't know why they're elevating the 3rd quarterback unless they know something in which Trevor Lawrence may not play. If that's going to be the case, of course, Mac Jones, I'd still think is a capable enough quarterback to look in the direction of Brian Thomas Jr., the best wide receiver that they have, and get him highly implemented. Again, coming off a week in which he was healthy, played 91% of the offensive snaps, ran 34 total routes, but was only targeted on 12% of those overall routes. In a negative game script against the Minnesota Vikings, you're expecting at least 40 plus passing attempts from this offense. A secondary that, again, is allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. You would assume that Brian Thomas Jr. should at very base minimum be the number 20 overall wide receiver within the upcoming performance. Number 21 is Tank Dell. Now, like I mentioned earlier, Nico Collins did not practice today. If, in fact, we get another consecutive week in the absence of Nico Collins, expect a very similar performance out of Tank Dell in which we saw last week. 9 targets, 6 catches, 126, which over the course of this season thus far is the most receptions and receiving yards he has had within a single game. Therefore, we have an opportunity here in which, of course, he could have himself a great performance against the Lions, the 3rd best matchup at the wide receiver position, which we have most recently seen Jaden Reed, Calvin Ridley both go over 110 receiving yards, JJ 81 in a touchdown against the secondary. It's just a matter of, is Nico Collins going to be active? Because if he is, I think that just pulls more attention away from Tank Dell and makes him potentially an even stronger fantasy option within the given week. Hear me out. Back in 2023, in the games in which Tank Dell played 60% of the offensive snaps or more with an active Nico Collins, he was averaging 7.6 targets per game and 16.28 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. If Nico Collins returns, Tank Dell could be even better within the upcoming week, as a lot of the pressure is in the direction of Nico Collins and them trying to bottle him up in order to prevent him from taking over that entire game. Number 22. We have Darnell Mooney taking on the New Orleans Saints. Like I mentioned earlier, with Marshawn Lattimore being traded, and of course all of the defensive back injuries that this team has sustained, not only are they the 12th best matchup, but we're probably going to see Kirk Cousins, Drake London, and Darnell Mooney all have pop-off performances. Thus far this season, in games in which Darnell Mooney has been given 7 or more targets, he's averaging 15.66 fantasy points per game. Incredible numbers. And even though the last time against the New Orleans Saints, he wasn't given very much opportunity, 6 targets, 3 catches, 56 receiving yards, and 7.1 fantasy points. Again, with all of what has taken place with the New Orleans Saints secondary as of late with all the injuries and their most recent trade, you would assume that Darnell Mooney is in line for himself a lot of overall targets and a lot of upside, especially considering the last time out against his secondary, Kyle Pitts was a no-show, 0 receptions, could happen once again, which would elevate the overall potential of Darnell Mooney. Number 23 is Courtland Sutton. Now, like I mentioned earlier, despite the fact that they take on the Chiefs, which isn't an easy matchup at all, the fact of the matter is that Courtland Sutton, each of the last 2 weeks, has seen double-digit targets, has had 7 or more receptions, and 100 or more receiving yards. He has been incredible in all overall facets, and as we approach, we have an opportunity taking on the Chiefs, in which, of course, we're hoping that Bo Nix is going to be able to step up to the task on hand. Again, it is a championship defense, and luckily Courtland Sutton has been given as much opportunity as he has in the last 2 weeks, because he is going to be needed in order for this team to find any sort of offensive success, considering running the ball against this defense. I mean, it really isn't something that you want to do on a weekly basis. They have stopped literally everyone, even Derrick Henry. Therefore, we would assume that, of course, Courtland Sutton, who has had himself a 30% target share in the last 2 weeks, is going to be able to expand upon that. When we look at the overall production of Courtland Sutton last season against this Kansas City Chiefs defense, he scored 12.6 and 9.9 fantasy points against them with Russell Wilson. We're hoping for even more within the upcoming performance. Number 24 is Josh Downs. Now, this E tier is going to begin the slot receivers for the overall conversation. So we begin with Josh Downs, who, again, even though he didn't have himself an upside performance, 9 targets, 6 catches, 60 yards, we'll take it. Especially considering the offense didn't look great. 9 targets is still an incredible number for him. You got to remember, in the last 4 games with Joe Flacco starting or playing, He's averaged 9.8 targets, 7.5 receptions, 69 receiving yards, and a half a touchdown per game for 13.65 half PPR fantasy points per game. Has been able to get himself a 29% target share with Joe Flacco, and now has an opportunity of taking on the Buffalo Bills, who have mightily struggled against opposing slot receiving options. Miami 6 for 65, Seattle 11 for 115, and Tennessee 7 for 63. Therefore, the base minimum of 6 catches, 60 yards is in line for Josh Downs. The potential of getting even more fantasy points with a touchdown and or potential yardage, receptions, etc. is definitely on the table. Number 25, another slot receiving option is Ladd McConkey. Since the bye week, the Chargers have been throwing the ball 10 plus times per game more on average. Again, going from 23 passing attempts per game to 33 has definitely helped Justin Herbert. His overall comfort within this offense and getting continuous opportunities in the direction of Ladd McConkey has made him fantasy relevant. Now, as we approach taking on the Tennessee Titans, they haven't really, played well against slot receiving options either. Most recently, Pop Douglas 7 for 35. Khalil Shakir 7 for 65, Josh Downs 7 for 66 and a touchdown. If they're going to allow 7 plus receptions to consecutive slot receiving options, you would assume that Ladd McConkey is going to see himself an abundance of overall opportunity and potential success. If in fact Will Levis is going to start for the Tennessee Titans, expect a blowout and a lot of production from the Los Angeles Chargers offense. Number 26, another slot receiving option, Khalil Shakir. In 7 healthy games this season, he's had himself a 93% catch rate with Josh Allen. He is by far and away the favorite receiving option of Josh Allen. Not only does he lead the team in terms of total targets, receptions, etc., but he also leads the team in terms of total first down receptions. 20 of his 40 overall receptions have led to a first down. So when in need, he's looking in the direction of Khalil Shakir, someone that is averaging 6.1 targets, 5.7 receptions, nearly 65 receiving yards per game, and 0.3 receiving touchdowns for 11.09 fantasy points per game. Again, it is the 7th best matchup at the wide receiver position, and they've most recently last week given up 9 catches for 80 yards out of the slot to opposing slot receiving options. Therefore, Khalil Shakir should be in line for another major week here with Josh Allen. Number 27. Now, even though he doesn't primarily play in the slot position, I wanted to throw Jaylen Waddle into this overall conversation because very similar to, Tyreek Hill last week, taking on the Buffalo Bills secondary is not an advantageous overall conversation. And even though he ended with 2 receptions, -4 receiving yards, and 1 receiving touchdown, understand that the negative receiving yards came from the fumble Ruski at the end of the game, in which, of course, he got the negative yards because he got fumbled behind the line of scrimmage. But going into this week, taking on the Rams, the 9th best matchup, like I mentioned earlier, if you cannot stop JSN from going for 7 catches, 180 and 2 touchdowns, stopping Lockett for 3 for 63 and a touchdown, I would assume that, of course, this Tua Tagovailoa-led offense is going to help unleash Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle for the first time since week 1. And when these two go off against the LA Rams, it's going to make it a competitive shootout in which both of these offenses and fantasy pieces are able to find themselves in abundance of overall success. Number 27 is just basically because he doesn't see enough target opportunity. If Jaylen Waddle was seeing as much target opportunity as some of the more elite wide receivers that are getting potentially 8 to 10 targets per game, if he was given within that range, he would be a top 12 wide receiver every single week, no doubt. Number 28, we have Calvin Ridley. Speaking of recent opportunity shares, from week 7 through 9, has been able to get himself incredible, volume of targets, 8, 9, and 15 on those per game overall experiences, but a 29% target rate and target share. Very promising numbers. Now, of course, there is still the question as to who is going to be playing quarterback this week. If, in fact, it is Will Levis, I am not starting Calvin Ridley. I would adjust his ranking to potentially being a low-end wide receiver 3, a high-end wide receiver 4. I have no interest in trying to mess with Calvin Ridley if, in fact, it is not going to be Mason Rudolph, because that is where he has found his success as of late. Now, going into this week, they do take on the Chargers. It is a middle-of-the-pack matchup, but as of late, of course, they have been brutalized by a couple wide receivers. Tillman, 6 catches for 75 and a touchdown. Judy in the same game, 7 for 73. Olave, 8 for 105. Sutton, 53 and a touchdown. We would assume that Calvin Ridley, with the opportunity share that he has been given as of late, is still going to be relevant. Hopefully, assuming that Mason Rudolph is active. Number 29 is Marvin Harrison Jr. Look, Marvin Harrison, last week, again, the entire game script was run the ball. Because they took an early lead in the defense, played incredibly well. They did not have to do anything else but run the ball. As an offense, they threw the ball 20 times and ran the ball 34 total times. Therefore, there was no opportunity for Marvin Harrison. He was quite literally the only wide receiver on roster to have a reception last week. So as a whole, not the greatest overall experience, but now has an opportunity of taking on the Jets, which hopefully makes it a potential shootout because, again, we want to see more opportunity go in the direction of Marvin Harrison. But wide receivers against the Jets as of late, we've talked about, Tank Dell, an incredible week last week, 6 catches for 126. Pickens the week prior, 5 for 111 and a touchdown. Justin Jefferson, 6 for 92. Courtland Sutton, 60 for a touchdown. We've seen a lot of wide receivers find success even against one of the most difficult matchups at the wide receiver position. Number 30, we have DJ Moore. Now, I know there's a lot of rumors regarding DJ Moore, his effort levels, and all this kind of jazz. Listen, he wants to win. And as to how his body language portrays that, I understand. So as of right now, I'm looking at DJ Moore and I'm thinking to myself, I probably should have 2 or 3 better options than DJ Moore going into this week. And if I don't, again, you might want to look elsewhere. But this is a guy that we want to wait and see if he's able to find any sort of semblance of success. Because yes, he is still given opportunities. 9 targets, had the most amongst all the receiving options of the Bears last week. So as long as the opportunities are there, that is promising, but it requires that this offense protects Caleb Williams in order to find DJ Moore open down the field. Taking on New England is not an issue. I think the secondary at times has found themselves struggling. Even this most recent week, Nick Westbrook-Ikine was solid, so was Calvin Ridley. So why not DJ Moore? As long as they could protect Caleb Williams, he could be fantasy successful and relevant. Number 31 is Jauan Jennings, who, of course, as of late is coming off of his hip injury. Earlier today, did get himself a limited participation in practice, which is promising in comparison to the most recent weeks in which he had no participation at all. But when we look at the last couple seasons, 2023 to 2024, regular season plus playoffs, in games in which Jauan Jennings has been given 5 or more targets, is averaging 9.47 half PPR fantasy points per game. And that is excluding the 41-point performance in week 3 of earlier this season. So if we take that into account, of course, he's probably averaging over 11 fantasy points per game in that overall circumstance, if not more. But now that you have Christian McCaffrey returning, the entire offense gets elevated. And Jauan Jennings should be playing the potential role of what, Brandon Ayuk has left vacated. It's either going to be him or Ricky Pearsall. I'm going to assume that they're going to lean in the direction of the veteranship of Jauan Jennings as of right now. It could eventually be won by Pearsall, but time will tell. They're taking on the 5th best matchup at the wide receiver position against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who cannot stop a soul in their secondary considering all the injuries that they've gone ahead and accumulated over the course of the season. Number 32, we have Amari Cooper. Just in the same way in which it took a little bit of time for D-Hop to go ahead and have himself a monster performance, I think this is the week for Amari Cooper. Hopefully he's going to be healthy and ready to return from his wrist injury that, of course, held him out last week. But going into this week, of course, Keon Coleman is dealing with a very similar injury. So if Keon Coleman is going to be out, Amari Cooper is going to be starting, I would anticipate that Josh Allen is going to litter him with a high volume of overall opportunity, in the same way in which, of course, Keon Coleman has been given opportunities the last couple weeks. Keon Coleman should have scored a touchdown last week if it wasn't for the fact that he bobbled that reception and it was intercepted by Jalen Ramsey. That's 2 consecutive weeks in a row in which they're giving him red zone opportunities within the receiving game. That could be an opportunity in which, of course, Amari Cooper could take advantage of and run with for the remainder of the year. Taking on the Colts, an advantageous matchup. I'm anticipating success for Amari Cooper. Number 33, we have Xavier Legette. Earlier today, we did get a confirmation that Bryce Young will once again be starting for this team taking on the Giants. This is going to be either a neutral or negative game script. Whichever way it goes, you got to remember, Xavier Legette is getting himself opportunity, and this offense is still able to move the ball with Bryce Young. He has scored a touchdown each of the last 2 games. So as long as those opportunities continue to go in his direction, I'm anticipating success, regardless of the matchup against the Giants. Number 34 is Jameson Williams. Now, we've talked about this in the past. He is now being activated from his suspension and should be ready to go. But in the last 4 games, his overall opportunity share has not been great. But luckily, he's been able to save majority of his overall fantasy performances with big receptions. As of thus far this season, he has had receptions of 37, 70, 52, and 50 yards. A lot of those overall plays leading to a touchdown. Therefore, if he isn't going to make a huge play down the field, luckily he does take on the Texans, the 6th best matchup at the position. We've most recently seen Davante Adams absolutely annihilate DBs at the line of scrimmage, completely snapping them up. If Jameson Williams can turn on the burners, he can absolutely make a singular play to make his entire fantasy week as a wide receiver 3. Number 35, we have Jordan Addison, who's coming off a performance of the most receptions within a single game this season, 5. Which again is very promising because outside of that, it was just 3 receptions every game, and we were hoping he scores a touchdown. Luckily, he got himself 5 receptions, 42 and a touchdown, and coincidentally enough, it was with the return of TJ Hawkinson. Going forward, taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars, the 4th best matchup at the position, we're going to assume that the Minnesota Vikings are going to pour it on and probably score at least 5 touchdowns as an offense, hopefully one in the direction of Jordan Addison. Number 36, we have Quentin Johnston taking on the Tennessee Titans. What we're hoping is that L'Jarius Sneed, the number 1 cornerback and an incredibly talented cornerback, is going to be inactive for another consecutive game. If, in fact, we can get that confirmation, Quentin Johnston will be a significantly more relevant wide receiver in comparison to having to be covered by L'Jarius Sneed for the entirety of the game. We're going to have to wait and see, but either way, with Herbert and the Chargers offense really clicking as of late, I'm expecting all the receiving options and Dobbins to be successful within the upcoming performance. If in fact Levis is the starting quarterback for the Tennessee Titans, expect a blowout and even more success for guys like Quentin Johnston. Number 37 is Rome Odunze, rookie wide receiver who just most recently had his second game of over 100 receiving yards and really even had an opportunity within the red zone and end zone target that was overthrown. If they continue to give him opportunities deep down the field, and obviously we've seen that he's had a pretty good connection with Caleb Williams, and hopefully their connection continues to blossom to the point to where Caleb is continuing to target him more than Keenan Allen and makes him the clear and away wide receiver too, it could unlock the potential of him really taking on and expanding his overall role for the remainder of the season, which again, as a top 10 wide receiver, he has really done very little in comparison to guys like Marvin Harrison and, of course, Malik Nabers, who have been significantly more kind of implemented within their offensive schemes as of late. Then we move on to number 38. It is Michael Pittman Jr. Michael Pittman Jr. is someone that I don't really want to trust. The fact of the matter is, he takes on Buffalo. It can't get worse than last week. 1 reception for 14 yards cannot be worse than that. Therefore, I'm just going to leave it up to you. If you want to play Michael Pittman Jr., pick your poison, because really at this point on, every single wide receiver will either score a touchdown and have a big week, or they're going to be a dud. Because after like 36 overall wide receivers, it gets relatively thin with 4 teams on bye. Then we move on to Demarcus Robinson, who again, speaking of, if he doesn't score a touchdown, he is pretty much going to be a significantly lesser option. Sure, he's playing 90+% of the overall snaps, had himself a lot of opportunity in the absence of Puka last week, but even with Puka in the lineup, we have seen on multiple occasions him be fantasy relevant, scoring touchdowns. Going back, of course, to the most recent game against Minnesota, which he scored 2 touchdowns on 3 total targets. So therefore, Demarcus Robinson could be an option. The final player I wanted to mention is Diontae Johnson. Obviously, most recently shipped from the Carolina Panthers over to the Baltimore Ravens. It is a short week, but I think typically the second game for a wide receiver being traded is when they begin to really step up. Hopefully they'll give him more opportunity within this upcoming game, as he will be a little bit more relevant considering how advantageous that matchup is against the Cincinnati Bengals. All right, that's going to cover it in regards to my top 40 wide receiver rankings. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Again, I'll be live later tonight, starting at 7 p.m. PST. If you cannot make it to the live stream, I will post the live stream tomorrow morning. So again, if you haven't watched, you can watch it back tomorrow if that is something that you're interested in. Otherwise, I will be back tomorrow talking about quarterback and tight end rankings, sharing my entry to the Thursday night overall matchup, Friday hidden gems, live streams every single night. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.